Alright, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Tokenicer and I'm here to bring you guys in-depth analysis, insights, and news from the digital asset space, along with covering the progressive tokenization of the world. So in today's video, I'm bringing you guys another Terramoon exclusive for my weekly show on there, Tea Time with Token. In this week's episode, we took a deep dive into Gilbert Verdian's background to see why this man's really just one of the most accomplished names in all of blockchain and DLT. From his connections before he started up Quant, all the way to everything that's happened since then. And then we also took a look at a couple notable speakers that are showing up at CordaCon this year and seeing what kind of connections those guys have. So if you guys want full access to this deep dive, in addition to everything else like Brian's TA, first access to any deep research I find, and my weekly show of Tea Time with Token, where we do a bunch of deep dives into a lot of strong fundamental projects, be sure to check out Terramoon Ventures, and I'll be sure to link it right down below. And as always, if you guys do decide to join, I do have a discount code, which is Tokenicer, for 25% off. And as always, none of what you're about to hear or read, or even what you get if you join Terramoon Ventures, is any form of financial or investment advice, as none of us are financial advisors. But now that we got that out of the way, let's get right into it. Pretty much everything that's happened with Quant over the past couple months since we've last discussed it. I guess we've kind of been discussing Quant in pretty much every tea time here and there, so it's probably not the best way to say it, but just kind of all the major news that's happened. And we're also going to look into Gilbert Verdian's whole background, in addition to some of the stuff that I recently dug up at CordaCon this morning. So we're going to start off with this mind map of Gilbert. I did drop it on the Twitter the other day. I gave you guys a sneak peek beforehand, but we're going to take a deep dive and look at just everything this man's connected to, because as we can see here, his background is quite insane to say the least. And then we're also going to look at some of the recent Quant news. Some of it not so recent, but some of the more significant stuff that we found. And then, as I had mentioned, we're going to take a look into CordaCon. So CordaCon is pretty much a convention that's held by R3, and it gets its name CordaCon from their blockchain platform Corda, right? And we'll dig into some of the speakers there in just a minute, but you guys are going to see just how big this convention is. As you guys have probably heard, Corda is one of the biggest names in the blockchain and DLT space right now. A lot of these industrial applications are either currently built on Corda, Accenture, or Hyperledger. And then there's, of course, the occasional Hedera hash graph. But yeah, Corda is one of those bigger names, especially with CBDCs. Corda and Accenture, well, R3 and Accenture get constantly mentioned in these BIS CBDC projects, and we'll dig a bit into some of these in just a bit. I had mentioned a couple of them previously that are using R3 or Accenture, those being Dunbar, Jura, and Helvetia. But there's a lot more CBDC projects that are going on outside of the Bank for International Settlements that we'll get into. Well, they all in some way tie back to the Bank for International Settlements, but yeah, let's just hop right in. So let's start off with Gilbert. So many of you guys had probably seen this already. Basically, how I wanted to format this is I didn't want this directly to be a Quant Network mind map. I've made a ton of those, and I know a ton of others on crypto Twitter who have also made a ton of those. I wanted this to be very Gilbert specific. I wanted this to be tied to what Gilbert Verdian himself is tied to, rather than just what Quant Network is tied to. And so here, we have these main pillars. So these would be MIT, New Southern Wales, Hyperledger, CBDCs, the European Commission, and gov.uk. Now, I kind of chose these at random, and partway through, I kind of realized these probably weren't the best pillars to be putting for Gilbert's connections, but they did end up working fairly well. So, let's see what connects. Obviously, we're not going to go over every connection because we're probably going to end up getting lost or repeating a bunch of these connections. I mean, I want to say there's at least over 100 in here. I'd say we could say that pretty confidently. There's at least over 100 lines of connections within this board. But okay, so start with the European Commission. So I didn't really make this connection up until recently, actually. And pretty much what I'm drawing this connection to is that we see he was actually a member of the EU Commission, specifically in their blockchain observatory forum, and for blockchain policy and framework conditions. That's a pretty big position to be holding, right? Like, you're officially a member of the European Commission, and not just any small member either, right? You're a forum member for blockchain policy and framework conditions in their working group. And well, when blockchain and DLT overall is having it still be such a gray area in terms of how the space should go, well, they're going to take that position pretty seriously, right? They want the best people watching over that and governing over the future regulations of that. So having Gilbert Verdian there should say a fair amount. And so what I tied this to is the MiCA bill. MiCA, as many of you guys might know, we've talked about this a lot in our LCX breakdown, stands for Markets and Crypto Assets. And pretty much this is a bill that's been going around the EU for about a good 2 years now. It was first drafted up in, I believe, September of 2020. So not quite 2 years yet, but we're approaching there. And it's moving pretty fast. A lot faster than how the US is moving with regulations. They already tried banning proof of work mining once. And well, that part of the bill did get voted out. So why am I mentioning MiCA? MiCA being drafted in 2020, officially coming out in September of 2020, lines up pretty well with Gilbert's time at the EU Commission, or May 2018 to May 2021. Now, some people might be thinking, okay, well, the European Commission is pretty huge. Like, who's to say Gilbert is confirmed to have been responsible of having drafted some of the stuff in MiCA up? Well, there's no confirmation. Like, we can't really get confirmation of this. But what we can assume off of and connect the dots with is look at the position Gilbert Verdian was holding at the EU Commission. Blockchain Policy and Framework Conditions Working Group. That might as well be what MiCA is. MiCA is a bill on crypto and DLT as a whole. So if you guys actually go on the MiCA bill, like it's not the easiest to get to, so I will link it down in the description below along with the Tea Time text channel. But essentially MiCA doesn't just cover crypto assets, but it covers the underlying technology. So what DLT is, what value added within the economy can it provide, and what solutions does it provide to our current industries and infrastructures. So it's the name Markets and Crypto Assets might be a bit misleading because it's really an overall bill on how the EU wants to take blockchain and DLT into their future economy. This title, Blockchain Policy and Framework Conditions, it kind of means the same thing as what MiCA talks about. So that's why I'm tying in MiCA to Gilbert's position at the EU. As you guys can see, I also tagged LCX, London Stock Exchange, and Alliance Block up here. Reason being, these are quant partners, but I think it's pretty fair to say that quant partners are also tied to Gilbert, right? Like, Quant and Alliance Block are tied together. Quant and LCX are tied together. But that also doesn't just stop there, right? That also means Gilbert Verdian and Monty Metzger are probably tied and connected in some form, especially because these two are having one part of their partnership be on the actual underlying technology and platform side of things, where They're building an overledger gateway on LCX, right? But the other part of this partnership is that Quant and LCX are also collaborating for an interoperable CBDC research. And I've shared some of those theories behind some potential collaborations they have, and just, weren't shared to the public because a lot of CBDC stuff isn't going to be shared to the public. But we've tied a lot of dots to Monetary Authority Singapore and the Bank of Canada between Quant and LCX with an interoperable CBDC. And that's through their own respective CBDC projects, Project Ubin for Singapore and then Project Jasper for Canada. Now, let's move on a little from the EU Commission and MICA overall and talk about GovUK. They're essentially the core economic infrastructure for overall the UK, so obviously they're very big and have a ton of authority. And we can see a bunch of these side subsidiary connections of GovUK that are obviously also connected to Gilbert, right? So we see Her Majesty's Treasury and Ministry of Justice UK. So Her Majesty's Treasury kind of works as the head treasury for UK, and they're also responsible for carrying out all the financial, economic, and fiscal policies within the UK. I should mention the position Gilbert held at HM Treasury wasn't just some regular position in like sales or something either. He was, well, if we go here, he was Chief Security Officer and Deputy Chief Technology Officer. So yeah, a C-level position at governmental job is, that's not easy to land. And then he also worked in cross-market operations resilience groups for the Bank of England. That's kind of just a fancy way of saying we look out for national and systemic risks to our financial system, especially in cybersecurity. Well, that's a pretty big position to be holding too, right? Like, when you're kind of responsible for governing and looking over your country's financial security, well, you'd better have the experience to back that up. Let's add a little further on to that and take a look at this connection line. So this is the Bank of England and MIT. We all know Quant and MIT have collaborated to form ODAP, right? And I guess since I brought up ODAP, we're going to be jumping a little all over the place right now, but ODAP stands for Open Digital Asset Protocol, and it actually changed up its name very recently, like I think within the past 2 weeks or something, but it's no longer called ODAP. It's called SAT, Secure Asset Transfer. Yeah, just Secure Asset Transfer. That's what they're referring to ODAP to nowadays. But yeah, SAT, that's what MIT and Quant are looking to build. And what this is the border gateway protocol for the Internet of Value. And simply put, ODAP will be what allows for interoperability to seamlessly flow from one network to another within all of blockchain and DLT. It'll be a standard that's implemented in every application layer without tampering the actual layer itself, which is really important because a lot of these interoperability protocols and solutions, you actually need to do something else to the underlying layer 1 itself to get it to interoperate with another network, whether that be wrapping, burning, whatever. There's a lot of different solutions for interoperability at the moment that might not be the most viable solution, especially when it's at scale. Like for example, when you're using synthetic assets as a solution for interoperability, that is going to be a issue down the line because you're essentially offering a derivative of something onto another chain and saying, oh, it's interoperable. Like, no, it's not interoperable. You just have a synthetic derivative of this on your chain. Let's get back to SAT. Now, why is this so big? For those of you who don't know, MIT is also the one that established TCP/IP. TCP/IP is what allows you to pretty much watch this video at the moment if you're not watching it on a MacBook Air. So it's pretty massive. It's what allows the internet to work at scale. So they are doing this through the IETF. The IETF is the Internet Engineering Task Force. These are the guys that also helped establish TCP/IP, and pretty much any internet standard, any digital standard that operates through the internet is going to have to go through the IETF. So think of it as like the ISO, so International Organization of Standardization. We know about ISO, right? Like ISO 2200, ISO TC 307. We did a whole breakdown and deep dive of ISO in one of the previous Terra links. We know how big ISO is. Well, IETF is basically the internet version of ISO. And well, just to highlight a couple members that are also working on ODAP, because ODAP is an open standard. Open standards essentially mean that you have to work and collaborate with other parties to get the standard to be agreed on and adopted. So you can't really be building an open standard in private. And well, when you're building interoperability standards, they're going to have to be open standards. It doesn't make sense to have closed standards to be interoperability. That's very contradictory. But let's look at some of the other members that have kind of worked alongside ODAP. So Intel, they have also collaborated with ODAP, and they've been cited in some papers. Visa, their UPC, so Universal Payments Channel, had also mentioned and referenced ODAP and another interoperability protocol that was drafted up onto the IETF between Martin Hargreaves, Quant Chief Product Officer, and Thomas Harjano, the CTO of MIT Connection Sciences. And then we've also got IBM down here. IBM has also been cited in some of their papers, and their IBM Weaver protocol is actually said to be ODAP compliant. Weaver is IBM's interoperability solution for blockchain and DLTs. And well, I believe it is in some form a white label of Hyperledger Weaver, which is another Hyperledger application. Guess who also happens to be working to adopt ODAP? Hyperledger. So their future work for Q1 of 2022 was to support the Open Digital Asset Protocol on Hyperledger Cactus. Remember, Open Digital Asset Protocol is ODAP, which is now SAT. I'm just gonna keep calling it ODAP because I'm not a fan of SAT. So for simplicity purposes, we're gonna continue calling this ODAP. Hyperledger Firefly, they were adding multi-ledger support. Now, I don't know who else does multi-ledger support besides Quant, right? You hear cross-chain support all the time, but Quant is the only one that uses multi-ledger, and they use it pretty exclusively. Like, I don't think I've heard them use cross-chain much, if at all. Weaver, look at this. Relay module, more robustness, add message queuing features, distribution, and load balance make compatible with ODAP. Interesting. Okay, so I think that's a confirmed connection. So here's just a little timeline on how this all came together. So the concept of ODAP came in 2020 when Quant was first talking with MIT. I can't remember where. It may or may not have been Sybos, which is a FinTech Swift held event. That was in 2019 though, I believe. So maybe they first met and were talking about ODAP, and Gilbert Verdian had said MIT just understood them right away. Like, they clicked when they first talked, and no pun intended, but connected when they both brought up their future vision of interoperability. And since then, they've worked to build out ODAP. And well, since 2020, and as I said, because this is an open standard, you're going to get other public and private sector members. There's been a lot of interest from some of the people or some of the entities I've just mentioned. But ODAP officially, the paper for ODAP officially came out onto the IETF in, I believe, mid-November of 2021. Then in November of 2021, they came up with a new and much improved draft. So mid-November of 2021, then in February of 2022, so not even 3 months after yet, MIT had announced they were working with the US Federal Reserve on CBDC collaborations. That's interesting, right? So, you know, it was pretty interesting at that point. I was like, okay, well, I think potentially ODAP could be the reason they're working together, because the US government has stated their interest in what's being built with ODAP. And then shortly after, the Bank of England also announced they were working with MIT. So now these dots were starting to come closer, right? I was like, okay, I know the Bank of England has a ton of connections to Quant already and Gilbert. So this really wouldn't surprise me if they're working on ODAP. And then literally a couple days later, the Bank of England happened, I believe, March 6th. And I think Bank of Canada got announced March 8th. I could be wrong on those dates, but they were very close in between each other. They also announced they were working with MIT. So that was really eye-opening, and that really made me want to dig more. So we knew there were some connections with the US and Bank of England, given Gilbert's previous work experience at both these places, but Gilbert had never worked in Canada before. So that got me kind of curious, and I did a bit of digging. Well, before we go back to the past, well, I guess this happened in the past anyways. What am I saying? FT Live. So this event was held in April this year, and pretty much we saw some of the biggest names in crypto come on and discuss some of the issues going on with the industry, and also how we can further build upon it and really implement this for mass adoption. And who do we see here as some of the speakers for the CBDC Leaders Panel? And, well, just keep this in mind. This is a CBDC Leaders Panel. So it's pretty big to be featured up here. We see Timothy Lane, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. See Gilbert Verdian, of course. We see Charlotte Hogg, CEO Visa Europe. Thomas Harjano, CTO of Connection Sciences MIT, and the co-author of ODAP. I've mentioned this before, but this whole panel was very connected to begin with, because Visa, as I had mentioned, had cited ODAP. ODAP was made from Quant and MIT. And, well, I don't doubt it at all that Visa is also working to push the ODAP adoption. But now let's move on to the Bank of Canada, because the only connections between the Bank of Canada and this panel we see right now is between Bank of Canada and MIT working together, right? So let's look a little further. And I had mentioned some of these connections before, so this might not be news to some of you guys, but let's just go into this quickly. Gilbert Verdian worked at Vocalink, right? Vocalink is a payments company that MasterCard has a 92% stake in. He also won CISO of the Year during 2017 there, CISO being Chief Information Securities Officer. And they had also won Team of the Year. So they're pretty big, and in fact they are based out in London, UK, where Quant is also based out of, and Payments Canada. So Payments Canada is responsible for all the cross-border payments, and both in their low-value transfer system and the high-value transfer system. Who did they partner with to build out their high-value payment system, which is titled Links, which they recently built out over the past couple years, is done through real-time gross settlements through Vocalink. That's not much of a connection, right? You guys are probably thinking, okay, well, Gilbert worked there, Bank of Canada partnered with them, so what? Bank of Canada is also connected to SIA. SIA is, well, firstly, one of Quant's biggest partners, but two, they're one of the biggest payment providers in the world. Biggest in Europe, and around the world, they're second only to SWIFT. So they're really big, and essentially all of SEPA. So SEPA is, I forget what it stands for, but it's essentially what allows payments to run across Europe. That's all done through SIA. In fact, SIA's fiber optic network of they have their own network for payments and remittances and all that kind of stuff. That there I think it's called a fiber optic line, but that line ranges 209,000 kilometers. So that's enough to wrap around the world 5 times. So that goes to show you how big they are. And well, Quant's been partnered with them for quite some time now, and well, that's led to a bunch of other partnerships that we'll talk about in just a moment. But I think we've covered a fair amount of ODAP. Let's just finish up this connection with the Bank of Canada. So the Bank of Canada, again, as I said, is connected to SIA. Now their CBDC project, Project Jasper, which I've mentioned multiple times, is also connected to Monetary Authority Singapore's Project Ubin. How they connect is really interesting because when you look on their white papers, there's multiple mentions of an interoperability standard. That sounds a lot like ODAP. And then there's also a lot of mentions of ISO for an interoperability standard. What ISO standard do we know of that is working in blockchain and DLT? Because that's where CBDCs are going to be built, right? It's a pretty known fact at this point that CBDCs are probably going to be built on a blockchain, on a distributed ledger. There's one standard for blockchain and distributed ledger interoperability. That's ISO TC 307. The same standard that Gilbert Verdian had built out during his time in New Southern Wales. So that's really interesting, right? And then we also see that in the Blockchain Research Institute, which is founded by Don Tapscott, an advisor for LCX and the senior advisor for the World Economic Forum. The Bank of Canada is also part of that. Monetary Authority Singapore, I believe, is also part of that. So there's some connections there. And just to add on to that a little more, LCX was in a closed room private central bank meeting that saw 15 senior executives from central banks and World Economic Forum members. And this was held in Singapore. These lines are kind of starting to add up now, right? I feel like we've covered this half of the connections pretty well. We've covered everything connects to GovUK, to MIT, and I'll mention BSI quickly. BSI stands for the British Standardization Institute, and well, Gilbert Verdian did hold a position there for a few years, for almost 5 years actually, and pretty much his role here was to delegate the standardization of ISO TC 307 across UK. Now let's quickly go over some of these connections that don't directly link to these larger pillars. KPMG. Essentially, KPMG had shortlisted Quant on their FinTech Innovators 2021. Deloitte is a very similar thing, but Deloitte does have a little more connection. Laura Verdian, Gilbert's wife, prior to her time at Quant, she spent a good 5 years at Deloitte as their head of economics. So nothing super concrete there, but I definitely do believe there are connections to Deloitte because Deloitte had also shortlisted Quant. And prior to this, Laura had also worked at Pfizer. I don't think I need to explain who they are. They're a big pharmaceutical company. And well, Quant does have some connections to healthcare overall with their collaborations with Interopen, and I really believe that Oracle is going to be that gateway for them to have more of these healthcare solutions. And well, who did Oracle buy out most recently in April? Cerner. Cerner is a multi-billion-dollar healthcare data company. And so I think we could see more connections within the healthcare industry from Quant due to this partnership, especially because Overledger is offered as a service on Oracle too. And so why am I talking about healthcare? Gilbert Verdian worked for multiple governments, right? One of them was New Southern Wales, which is down in Australia. This is actually where Gilbert got the whole idea for all of Quant, ISO TC 307, ODAP. Without him working in Australia, I'm not sure if any of this would have happened. Essentially, what happened was, during his time in New Southern Wales. He worked in their financial department, but also their healthcare department, where he was responsible of kind of just keeping track and securing all of the patient data. What frustrated him was that there wasn't a way to simply connect all these siloed databases together. Makes sense, right? Legacy systems don't interoperate. They work in silos by nature. Wouldn't it be nice if they all connected together? Well, that's kind of what Gilbert thought, and instead of complaining about it and being like, fuck, this is gonna be a pain in the ass to deal with, he was like, okay, well, I think I'm just gonna build this out myself. And that's essentially what he did. And, well, ISO had liked what he had built out so much. They were like, can we turn this into an ISO standard? And of course Gilbert was like, yeah, of course. And well, here we have ISO TC 307 now. And because of his work at New Southern Wales, the Australian government was so impressed they had decided to have their government and enterprise cloud side of AU Cloud partner with Quant and have that be off, and have Overledger also be a solution there, which makes sense, right? And well, an interesting fact about ISO TC 307 and Australia is actually the governing country for this specific standard. And well, a lot of these connections are more indirect connections to Quant. So we've got Moby here, which Quant had joined, and also has a lot of connections to some of Quant's personal connections, right? Like to Constellation Network, to Coinbase, and Inatba is a very similar thing. What's interesting about Inatba though is that Quant is a founding member of Inatba. And while that's not saying a lot, Inatba I believe has over 80 founding members, so it's really a dime a dozen to be a founding member of Inatba. But Inatba stands for the International Association for Trusted Blockchain Applications, and well, they've got a lot of policymakers and private sector projects and big corporations in there, so I do believe they are very big and will play quite a role in, well, they already have played quite a role in regulating and standardizing how blockchain and DLT should be used across industries. We've just tied all of Quant's partners here. They're all pretty much partners and contributors to Inatba, so that being LackChain, Oracle, and SIA. I'm not going to go too deep into the partnerships in this video, but essentially LackChain partnered with Quant to connect all of Latin America together and build out the Latin American dollar, which will be tied to Citibank. We mentioned Oracle, and as for SIA, we also mentioned what SIA is going to be doing with Quant. Well, what they've already done, right? They've already connected multiple blockchain platforms on not only SIA chain, which is their own personal chain, but R3's Corda, which they're a really close partner with, and then also JP Morgan's Quorum, Ethereum Enterprise clients, and yeah, pretty much those industrial blockchains. So like your hyperledgers, not like, I don't know, your Solana or AVAX. Like, banks probably aren't going to want to be using Solana or AVAX for financial transactions, and I think that's pretty reasonable, especially when you have a network that's been shutting off more than once a month. And then as for their CBDC connections, we've got the Digital Pound Foundation. So some of these aren't official CBDCs. These are more what I'd call tokenized currencies. So the Digital Pound Foundation is a private sector consortium that consists of Ripple, Electroneum, Avalanche, Accenture, CGI Group, and a couple others. And well, what's interesting about the Digital Pound Foundation though is that if you go on the Gov UK website, you can actually find the Digital Pound Foundation on there. And the reason for this is that the economy in UK actually wants both the public and private sectors to be working together to find a way to tokenize the British pound. So I think that's pretty good to see. You want to see this
sort of open collaborativeness between the public and private sectors, especially when it's for something like this. It's essentially going to be the money we use every day, and well, I think the private sector should have some sort of say in that. The Bank for International Settlements, we've broken down kind of the projects that are going on in here. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole today because that can be a multi-hour long rabbit hole, so I'll just sum it up with the Bank for International Settlements, while not directly name-dropping Quant, has mentioned things of interoperability through API gateways, and these are through their projects Helvetia, Dura, MCBDC, and Dunbar. And of course, these other CBDC projects that are more focused on the central banks themselves than kind of proof of concepts, right? So one thing I should say is that these CBDC projects are all proof of concepts, meaning it's not just like, oh, we're gonna build a, I don't know, tokenized US dollar. No, these proof of concepts are more like, okay, can we get this tokenized US dollar to interoperate with the London Stock Exchange? And how would we do that? Which interbank clearing systems would we need to go through? And how can we do that in the most efficient way possible? So that's what the Bank for International Settlements is working more on. And as we had mentioned, R3 and Accenture are pretty much the two primary blockchain platforms that are being used for CBDC development at the moment, whether that be from the Bank for International Settlements or from these central banks themselves. And I've said it many times before, but I really think R3 and Accenture, if we could, would be some of the best investments we could make in this space, especially with CBDC development going on. Like, they kind of have a monopoly on overall applications that you can use to build CBDCs at the moment. And well, we can't really invest into these exactly because they don't have their own token, and they're a private equity company. So the best thing we can do is find who's best connected to R3 and Accenture and invest in those guys. And obviously none of that was any form of financial or investment advice. I'm just connecting the dots together. I guess the International Monetary Fund, will cover this one real quick before moving on to CordaCon and what's happened recently at Quant. But the International Monetary Fund has actually cited Quant and Overledger in multiple of their papers for an interoperable CBDC. The World Economic Forum had also done the same very recently, which we'll also be covering. But just regarding some further connections to the IMF and Quant, Gemini has actually written a little report saying that the IMF is confirmed to be using Quant as an MCBDC solution, and this was actually also on Quant's website, well, their old website before they had the revamp, where they said in one of their solutions, which was minting multi-ledger stablecoins from fiat funds held in escrow, that the IMF is actually already leveraging this solution. But that's essentially it for the big primary connections. A lot of that is probably redundancy that you guys have heard before, but I wanted to do this from the point of view of Gilbert Verdian and not just Quant alone. Now, some quick news. So this actually, I just got news of this today, but Quant had hired a new member onto their team. Oops. So if we go to their team members here, I guess for some of you guys who hadn't seen the new website yet, here it is. But some interesting facts about this. They also added color onto their team members. I thought that was pretty nice. But this is their newest member. This is kind of why we went on the website, right? So Lisa, we're just going to call her Lisa. She is their chief revenue officer. Now, you usually don't hire a chief revenue officer unless you think you're going to be bringing in revenue and profits, right? So I think this kind of shows that Quant is expecting more profits in demand in the very near future. And they've probably ramped up in demand overall just over the past couple months with all the talks of CBDCs and stuff too, right? And just overall more applications needing interoperability once you enter the blockchain space. So Quant's team is kind of known for having quite insane backgrounds, right? Like we saw Laura with Pfizer, Deloitte, and all her other experiences in healthcare. We know Andrews worked at Swift and Deutsche Bank as head of directors and managing positions. And then, of course, we know of their advisors, Neil Smith, who was the ex-CEO and chairman of Comcast and also advises on Qualcomm. And then Guy Dietrich, who spent a good 27 years at Morgan Stanley before working at Rockefeller Management. And then, of course, we got Gilbert Verdian. So their team is very legit. It always has been. And that's part of what makes them so special. So Lisa is no different. She worked 22 years at Cisco. So Cisco is a very big tech company in North America, and I believe they operate pretty globally. They also do a lot of operations in kind of healthcare data and all those kinds of things. So to see a member or someone who worked at Cisco as a global sales executive leader join Quant as the chief revenue officer, I think is pretty bullish to see. Especially remember, this is during a big market downturn, and we're seeing Quant still adding members to the team. Like, you guys are seeing Coinbase fire people, CRO is firing people, and I'm sure a lot of other exchanges and projects are trying to cut down their members list. Quant just added another chief revenue officer, and not just some random either. But if we connect the dots a little, Oracle and Cisco have actually been working for quite some time now. I mean, they're pretty similar in like kind of building data or applications and software for the healthcare industry, right? So of course Quant is partnered with Oracle, so I don't think it's too surprising if we see collaborations between Cisco and Quant, either directly between each other or through Oracle. And then before we get on to CordaCon, let's take a look at this little paper that was put out by the World Economic Forum just this April, so 2 months ago. This was a little paper on interoperability, and this is the model that the Bank of England is using for central bank digital currencies in terms of interoperability. And what do we see here? We see API access. So who do we know that allows interoperability through APIs? Well, we know Hyperledger does it, right? With their Hyperledger, Hyperledger Weaver. But how exactly does that work? Well, it also works as a white label that IBM has used, right? And they've used this with their collaborations in a interoperable CBDC with HSBC. How exactly does the underlying interoperability work? Through API gateways, right? And there's a standard for that. That standard is ODAP, which Quant and MIT have built together. So the Bank of England is also working with MIT, right? I think this really confirms that the reason that these banks are working together is largely for ODAP. Now, let's move on to CordaCon. So I had made a couple posts about this on my Twitter just this morning because there's some really interesting connections that I want to save a couple of these for you guys. So some of these might be new, some of them might not. CordaCon is essentially a convention held by R3 every year, and it's for businesses and developers to kind of connect and talk together and see what's the best way to implement blockchain technology to their respective industries. And while there's a ton of members that appeared at CordaCon, let's just highlight some of the ones that I thought were quite significant. So Daniel Iden. He's an advisor for the Bank of International Settlements, and we talked about some of the connections to the Bank for International Settlements. But I just want to highlight that getting an advisor role for the Bank for International Settlements is no small task whatsoever. The Bank for International Settlements is essentially the central bank for central banks. Just about any G7, G20 nation central bank, you'll find in the Bank for International Settlements. It's a consortia of central banks. But what I found interesting about this is that, sure, there's that one little line of indirect connection between Quant and the BIS. But if we look down here, he was also a member of Standards Council of Canada. This is pretty much a council that helps mandate and push standards here in Canada. What standard was he specifically pushing? ISO TC307. The same one that Gilbert built. Interesting, right? And well, we had also talked about all the connections between the Bank of Canada and Quant and ODAP. So I think this ties it even further together. It's really interesting that this guy's now an advisor for the Bank for International Settlements. I mean, I don't think it's surprising to say that, or surprising to think that the BIS will also be TC307 compliant. I think that's more likely than not, honestly. But let's move on to a couple other members. We got John Velisarios. He's the global managing director for Accenture. And he's got quite the background in CBDCs. I mean, just look here. He's a committee member of the Digital Pound Foundation, which we know Quant is also multiple members of Quant are also members on this. He's an expert advisor on the Digital Euro Association. The Digital Euro Association is partnered with the Digital Pound Foundation. And XRP is also playing a big role in the Digital Euro Association. And XRP is also playing a role in the Digital Dollar Project, which John is also working as an expert advisor for. So this guy's got a ton of experience around central bank digital currencies, and from what it seems, he's probably very well respected in that department. And well, at Accenture, his position is literally digital assets custody and CBDC lead. So that says a lot. We got the product manager for SIA. I felt like I didn't even need to list his background here because, well, we know how Quant ties in with SIA, right? And then to finish it off, our last little connection we'll look over is Alan Lim. So he's the head fintech infrastructure officer for Monetary Authority Singapore, which we also mentioned had some connections to Quant and LCX, right? With the mentions of API gateways and that closed door World Economic Forum meeting with those other central banks. Let's take a look at where Alan had worked prior to the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So he spent 15 and a half years at IBM as the head of as a head at the Blockchain Center of Asia Pacific. So I think that is pretty big, especially because IBM is one of those bigger players in the kind of industrial blockchain space, right? Especially with the mention of IBM Weaver. And of course, everything else they're doing with like Hedera Hashgraph, Hyperledger, Mobi. IBM is one of those corporations that is a legacy company, but they're doing a really good job at kind of adopting this technology and making sure they're still going to be a key player. But we look up here, he also worked a year at Mojaloop. Well, he's actually still working at Mojaloop. What Mojaloop is essentially a mobile financial services application that's built by, or that's largely affiliated with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and actually also runs on Interledger protocol. Interledger is essentially a protocol that has some very close connections to XRP, and I believe also allows the use of XRP for settlement. I'm not too familiar exactly with the ins and outs of Interledger, but I know there are connections between Mojaloop, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Ripple. And of course we see, or I guess I didn't put this here, but Mojaloop has been confirmed to have connections to Project Ubin. Project Ubin being the CBDC for Monetary Authority Singapore. So, as we can see here, there are a ton of connections at not only CordaCon, but also just in Gilbert Verdian's background alone. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to unmute your mic now and fire away.